The doors of the Heritage Hall swing open, and the first thing you hear is the sound of 100 camera shutters going off at once. Michael Chan steps through, and the room shifts around him like water making room for a stone. Security fans out on either side of him, 3 men in dark suits who don't look at anyone directly but seem to see everything. Somewhere behind the velvet rope, a woman in emerald silk grips her clutch bag tighter and whispers something to the woman beside her. Neither of them stops smiling. Neither of them stops watching him. This is the International Luxury Heritage Expo, and everyone inside this hall already knows why Michael Chan is here. For 6 months, Korean tabloids have run the same headline in different fonts. Which family will finally secure the Chan heir? 3 of the country's most influential daughters are standing in this room tonight, each positioned near a display that took a small fortune to build, each one certain that tonight is the night. He doesn't stop at the first display. A woman in a champagne gown steps forward as he passes, her hand extended, her smile already rehearsed. He nods, brief and polite, and keeps walking. Behind him, her hand stays out a second too long before she lowers it, and the woman next to her leans in to say something that doesn't need to be said out loud. He doesn't stop at the second display either, or the third. Reporters near the entrance are already whispering into their phones, adjusting their angles, trying to guess where he's headed. A man near the bar mutters that maybe he's just walking the floor before making his choice. Nobody in that hall believes he came here to walk the floor. He stops in the far corner, where the lighting is dimmer and the crowd is thinner, in front of a booth so small it barely qualifies as a booth at all. A hand-lettered sign reads Parker Heritage Footwear. Behind a modest table sits a young woman in a plain gray blazer, her dark hair pulled back, a pair of hand-stitched leather shoes displayed on a strip of black velvet in front of her. She isn't posing. She isn't performing. She's adjusting the angle of one shoe so the light catches the stitching properly, the way she's done 100 times before, because she genuinely believes the craftsmanship deserves to be seen correctly, even if almost no one is looking. The hall goes quiet in sections, like a wave moving backward from where he's standing. Tiffany Parker looks up because the light changes before she understands why. And then she's looking directly at Michael Chan, and for a moment neither of them says anything because neither of them expected this. "May I?" he asks, and reaches for the shoe on the left. She doesn't answer right away. She's trying to work out if this is a joke, if someone paid him to walk over here as a stunt for the cameras, if there's some version of tonight where this makes sense. Nothing about her face changes in a dramatic way. She just watches him carefully, the way she'd watch anyone handling something she made with her own hands. "Go ahead," she says. He turns the shoe over, studies the stitching along the sole, runs his thumb across a seam that most people wouldn't even notice. "Hand-lasted," he says, more to himself than to her. "You know shoes," she says, and it isn't really a question. "I know when something's been made instead of manufactured." Somewhere behind him, a phone camera catches the exact second he sets the shoe down gently, like it matters to him that it lands right. That clip will be online in 4 minutes. It will have 2 million views by morning. He doesn't ask for her number. He doesn't pose for a photo with her. He simply pulls a chair from the neighboring booth without asking, sits down across from her small table, and asks her how long she's been making shoes by hand. "Since I was 6, she says. "Badly at first. And now people fly in from 3 countries to argue with me about heel height." A small laugh escapes him before he seems to realize it's happening, and something about the sound of it, unguarded, almost surprised at itself, makes 2 nearby socialites exchange a look neither of them can hide. By the time the Expo's PR team realizes what's happening and starts trying to reposition their cameras, the story has already written itself in 3 different group chats and 1 very fast blog post. Korea's most eligible billionaire ignored every heiress in the room and sat down with a woman nobody had heard of an hour earlier. Nobody in that hall knows why. Tiffany doesn't fully know why either. But 7 years earlier, long before any of this, her father had made a promise in a much smaller, much quieter room, and everything that happens next traces back to that promise. 7 years earlier, the workshop still had the name Brooks painted in gold above the door, and Samuel Parker still stood at his workbench most mornings before the sun was fully up, humming something tuneless while he worked leather that most craftsmen twice his age couldn't touch. He was the best in the country. Everyone said so. Fashion houses in Milan sent representatives to study his technique. A museum had once asked to display one of his pieces permanently. Tiffany grew up watching him from a stool in the corner of that workshop, handed scraps of leather to practice on before she was old enough to be trusted with real tools. She remembers small things from those years more clearly than big ones. The smell of beeswax on his hands at dinner. The way he'd hold a finished shoe up to the light before he'd let anyone touch it, checking for flaws only he could see. The way he never once raised his voice at her, even the year she ruined an entire hide of Italian leather trying to prove she could cut a pattern on her own. "You'll learn faster from this mistake than from 10 lessons, he told her, and made her help him clean the workshop floor instead of scolding her. The morning it fell apart started like any other. A courier arrived with a letter from the Heritage Design Council. Her father read it twice, standing very still, and then set it down on the workbench like it had gotten heavier in his hands. He'd been accused of stealing a design. Not copying, stealing, outright, a ceremonial pattern that had supposedly belonged to a rival craftsman who claimed Samuel had seen his private sketches and used them without credit. The accusation moved faster than the truth ever could. Within a week, 2 department stores canceled his contracts. Within a month, the museum quietly withdrew its offer. Within 3 months, the gold lettering above the workshop door had been painted over by a landlord who didn't want the association anymore. Tiffany remembers her mother crying in the kitchen with the door almost closed, thinking Tiffany couldn't hear. She remembers her father not crying at all, which somehow felt worse. He kept working, quieter than before, taking whatever small jobs came through, refusing every reporter who came asking for a comment. "Why don't you defend yourself?" she asked him once, when she was old enough to be angry about it on his behalf. He didn't look up from his work. "I did. Nobody wanted to hear it." "Then make them listen. Some truths don't get believed the first time you say them, Tiffany. Sometimes you have to wait for the right moment and make sure the proof speaks louder than you ever could." She didn't understand what he meant then. She would spend years trying to understand it later. He died 4 years after the accusation, quietly, in a hospital room that never once had a single reporter outside it, which felt like its own kind of injustice. The workshop went to her, what was left of it. A handful of loyal tools, a stack of unfinished orders nobody wanted anymore, and a name that made most buyers hesitate before they even looked at the craftsmanship. She could have changed careers. Everyone told her to. A cousin offered to help her find office work. A family friend suggested she sell the workshop and its equipment and start somewhere nobody knew the Brooks name. Instead, she reopened the shop under a different sign, worked 12-hour days for clients who paid barely enough to cover the leather, and rebuilt her father's reputation one pair of shoes at a time, refusing to let his name disappear the way everyone expected it to. It took 6 years before anyone outside her small circle of loyal customers noticed what she was doing. It took the Heritage Expo jury exactly 1 look at her submission to grant her a booth, the smallest one in the building, tucked in the back corner where foot traffic was thinnest. She almost didn't go. She told herself nobody at an event like that would care about hand-stitched shoes from a workshop most of Seoul had forgotten. Her mother, in one of their last conversations before Tiffany left for the expo, told her to go anyway. "Your father used to say the work speaks even when nobody's listening yet," her mother reminded her. "Go make it speak." The first year after her father's death, she taught herself to finish the orders he'd left half done, guessing his intentions from sketches in the margins of old notebooks. An elderly woman who'd worn nothing but Brooks shoes for 30 years showed up at the newly renamed shop, nose wrinkled, one hand still on the door. "You're not him." "No," Tiffany said, "but I learned from him." "Let me show you." 4 hours later, the woman left with her shoes and said nothing on the way out. She came back 3 weeks later with 2 friends. Then those 2 brought others. No headlines, no sudden recognition. Just one skeptical customer becoming a dozen, a name that used to mean something starting to mean something again, even with Parker painted over the door instead of Brooks. Her mother shows up at the workshop one evening, not long after the story breaks across every outlet in the country. A bag of groceries in hand she clearly didn't need to bring. "You know what happens to families who cross people like that?" she says, not looking up from the vegetables she's chopping. "He's not like that, Mom. He might not be, but the people around him might. Your father never went near a family with that kind of power, and look what still happened to him." Tiffany sets down her tools instead of arguing. I know what it feels like when someone actually sees the work instead of just the name attached to it. He does that. Her mother chops slower now, thinking. Just be careful. Some doors, once you open them, don't close again no matter how much you want them to. Neither of them knows yet how right that will turn out to be. Back at the expo, word of what happened spreads through the hall faster than the event's own schedule can keep up with. By the time the evening's formal program is supposed to begin, half the guests are more interested in the woman in the corner booth than in the keynote speaker. Nora's son watches from across the room, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand, her expression pleasant and entirely unreadable to anyone who doesn't know her well. She has spent 3 years positioning herself as the obvious choice for Michael Chan, attending the right galas, sitting on the right boards, being photographed at the right charity events beside his mother. Tonight was supposed to be the night that positioning paid off. Who is she? Nora asks the woman beside her, not turning her head. Nobody. Some shoemaker. Nora's smile doesn't move, but something behind her eyes does. Everybody's somebody, she says quietly. Find out who her father is. Across the hall, Michael's younger sister watches the same scene unfold with an entirely different expression. Open curiosity, a little delight, the look of someone who's been waiting years to see her brother genuinely interested in something that isn't a merger. Jaiwoo Chan makes her way over before the evening ends, introduces herself to Tiffany with a warmth that catches Tiffany off guard. You're the first person he's talked to at one of these things in 2 years who wasn't trying to sell him something, Jaiwoo says, settling into the empty chair beside the booth like she's known Tiffany for years already. I mean that as a compliment. I wasn't trying to sell him anything either. He sat down. He never sits down. Jaiwoo studies her for a second, something calculating and warm at once. I like you already. Fair warning, that usually terrifies people. By the time the expo's lights dim for closing, the two of them are talking like they've known each other longer than 40 minutes, and Michael watches the exchange from a short distance with the particular relief of a man who didn't realize how much he wanted his sister's approval until he saw it happen. Not everyone watching is charmed. In a private booth near the back of the hall, an older man in a dark gray suit sets down his drink without finishing it. Chairman Choi Seung-ho has attended 100 events like this one and rarely pays attention to any of them. But when someone near him mentions the shoemaker's name in passing, Brooks, they say, though the sign reads Parker now, his hand goes still against the table. Say that again, he says. Parker, Tiffany Parker. Apparently her father used to run some workshop years back. Choi doesn't respond right away. He's looking across the hall at a woman he's never met, feeling something cold settle into his chest that he hasn't felt in 7 years. He excuses himself early that night. Before he leaves the building, he makes one phone call, and the person on the other end doesn't ask many questions. Find out everything about her, he says. Quietly. Michael doesn't wait long to see her again. 3 days after the expo, he shows up at the workshop unannounced, standing in the doorway of a shop that smells like leather and beeswax, looking noticeably less comfortable than he did surrounded by cameras. You could have called, Tiffany says, not looking up from the shoe she's shaping over a wooden last. I don't have your number. That's not really an excuse for a man who runs half the shipping routes in East Asia. He almost laughs, almost. I wanted to see the workshop, not just the booth. She glances at him then, taking in the way he's standing, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly forward, like he's trying to make himself smaller in a room that clearly doesn't belong to someone like him. It's a small thing, but it's not nothing. You can sit, she says, nodding at the stool across from her bench. Just don't touch anything wet. He sits. He watches her work for nearly 20 minutes without saying much, and she finds herself unexpectedly at ease with the silence, which surprises her more than anything else about the visit. Why shoes? He finally asks. Because my father made shoes, and because a shoe is the one thing that has to be perfect and invisible at the same time. Nobody notices good shoes. They only notice bad ones. She sets down her tool. I like making things that only matter when they're done right. That's not a small ambition. It's not supposed to be small. It's just quiet. Most people I know confuse quiet with unimportant. Most people you know have never had to make anything with their hands. He doesn't argue the point, mostly because he suspects she's right. Over the following weeks, he comes back more than once, never with cameras, never with an entourage. One evening, he shows up holding 2 containers of noodles gone cold in the car, apologizing before she even lifts the lid. "You could have had someone deliver it hot," she points out. "I wanted to bring it myself, even cold." She doesn't argue with that, and something in her silence says more than either of them puts into words. Word gets around anyway, because word always does in a city where half the tabloids have someone paid to track his car. The attention doesn't sit easily with her. A journalist shows up outside the workshop asking questions about her father, and she has to physically close the door on him twice before he leaves. A boutique that had quietly agreed to stock a small line of her shoes suddenly backs out of the deal, citing scheduling conflicts that don't hold up under any real scrutiny. "Let me help," Michael says, the day she tells him about the boutique. "No, Tiffany, if I take your help now, every piece of respect I've earned for the last 6 years turns into a rumor about who I'm sleeping with." She says it flatly, not cruelly, just honestly. "I didn't build this to have it handed to me." He looks at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his expression, not frustration, something closer to recognition. Nobody in his world has ever turned down help from him. Nobody has ever wanted to earn something more than they wanted the easy version of it. "Okay," he says. "Then I won't help. I'll just be here." It's a small distinction, but it's the one that matters to her. The first time she meets his family formally, it isn't planned. Jaiwoo talks her into coming to a small dinner at the estate, promising it's nothing, just family, nobody dressing up. Tiffany arrives to find a dining room with a chandelier worth more than her workshop's entire annual revenue, and a table set with more forks than she has ever needed at one meal in her life. Chairman Kang, Michael's father, is polite in the specific way powerful men are polite to people they haven't decided the value of yet. He asks about her business with the tone of someone conducting due diligence rather than making conversation. 12 employees, is it?" he asks. 2, Tiffany says. "Myself and an apprentice 3 days a week." Something flickers across his face, not quite disapproval, something closer to recalibration. "And you intend to grow that?" "I intend to make sure every pair that leaves my workshop is made the way my father would have made it. Growth comes after that, not before it." Grandmother Kang, seated at the head of the table, watches this exchange with sharp, unreadable eyes. When dinner ends and the men retreat to discuss something involving shipping tariffs that clearly bores Jaiwoo half to death, the older woman catches Tiffany's arm gently on the way out. "You didn't flatter him," she says. "Most girls who sit at this table flatter him within the first 5 minutes. I didn't think it would help. It wouldn't have." For the first time all evening, something like genuine warmth crosses the old woman's face. "Come again. Bring your work next time. I'd like to see what a person who refuses to flatter my son is actually capable of making with her hands." It isn't approval, not yet, but it's the first door in that house that doesn't feel like it's about to close on her. The people around Michael don't share his patience for the arrangement. His grandmother, a formidable woman who has run the family's social calendar for 4 decades, requests a meeting with him that isn't really a request. "She's a shoemaker," his grandmother says, not unkindly, but firmly, the way she says most things. "She's the best shoemaker in the country." That's not the same as being the right choice for this family. "Grandmother, I've sat across from women whose entire personality is a list of their family's assets. She's the first person in years who said something to me that wasn't a strategy." His grandmother studies him for a long moment, and whatever she sees in his face makes her pause before her next objection. "Your father will not be as patient with this as I am." "Then I'll speak to my father." Michael doesn't argue the point directly beyond that. He's learned, over the years, that arguing with his grandmother rarely changes her mind. It only changes how carefully she plans her next move. What he doesn't yet know is that his grandmother isn't the only one making calls, and she isn't even the most dangerous one. Nora-san has spent the 2 weeks since the expo doing what she does best, gathering information quietly, patiently, and without leaving fingerprints. She learns about Samuel Parker's old scandal within days. She learns the name of the man who first raised the accusation against him within a week. And when she finally learns that the accuser had close business ties to Chairman Choi Seung-ho, she sits with that information for a long time before deciding exactly how to use it. She doesn't go to Michael. She goes to Choi directly. "I know who her father was," she says. When they meet privately at a members' club, neither of them are supposed to be seen entering together. "I know what happened to him 7 years ago. I don't know the details, but I know you do." Choi's expression doesn't change, but the room feels colder anyway. Be careful what you assume. I'm not assuming anything. I'm telling you that if this girl gets close enough to Michael Chan, someone eventually digs deep enough to ask why her father's accuser worked for one of your subsidiaries. She sips her drink, unbothered. I don't care about your secrets. I care about her staying far away from Michael. If our interests happen to align, I don't see why we shouldn't help each other. Choi studies her for a long moment. He spent 7 years making sure nobody asked the right questions about Samuel Parker. He isn't about to let a shoemaker's daughter and a socialite's jealousy be the thing that finally undoes it. Watch her, he says to the man on the phone that night. Everything she does, everyone she talks to, I want to know before she knows. He makes one more call before the night is over, to a man he hasn't spoken to in years, the same man whose accusation once buried Samuel Parker's name. They meet at a quiet noodle shop far from anywhere either of them is usually seen, and the old accuser looks visibly uneasy the moment Choi sits down across from him. She's asking questions, the man says, before Choi can even order tea. Not her. The Chan heir. Someone's poking at the old contracts. Nobody's poking at anything they can prove. You said that 7 years ago, too. Choi doesn't respond right away. Outside the window, the street is quiet, ordinary, the kind of evening nobody would ever suspect held a conversation like this one inside it. The girl doesn't know what she has. Keep it that way, and there's nothing to prove. And if she figures it out, Choi's jaw tightens just slightly, then we make sure she doesn't get the chance to tell anyone. A charity gala 2 weeks later becomes the first place Tiffany and Nora Sun stand close enough to speak directly, and Nora doesn't waste the opportunity. You clean up well, Nora says, looking Tiffany over with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a lifetime deciding, at a glance, exactly how much of a threat another woman represents. For a shoemaker. Thank you. I make my own dresses too when I have time, old habit. How resourceful. Nora's smile doesn't reach her eyes. You know, it's funny, I did a little reading on your father recently. Fascinating case. Tragic, really, how quickly a reputation can collapse when the wrong people decide it should. Tiffany goes very still, though nothing on her face gives it away completely. Is there a point to this? Only that some families have spent a very long time making sure certain doors stay closed. I'd hate for you to be standing in the wrong doorway when one of them finally opens. Nora's smile widens, pleasant and razor-edged at once. Enjoy the evening, Miss Parker. She walks away before Tiffany can respond, and it's only once she's gone that Tiffany realizes her hands have curled into fists at her sides, not from fear exactly, but from the unsettling certainty that Nora knows something she doesn't, and isn't finished using it. She tells Michael about the exchange in the car afterward. His expression hardens in a way she hasn't seen from him before, something colder and more focused than the quiet frustration he's shown at every other obstacle so far. She's connected to this somehow, he says. Or she's just cruel and knows how to sound like she knows more than she does. Maybe, but I'd rather assume the worse and be wrong than assume the better and be blindsided. Neither of them says it out loud, but the gala changes something for both of them. The quiet understanding that whatever they're circling isn't a private family matter anymore. It has teeth, and more than one person willing to use them. If you've been enjoying the story so far, take a second to hit like and subscribe, because what Tiffany doesn't know yet is that her name was never supposed to surface again, and someone in that room has spent 7 years making sure it never did. The surveillance starts small enough that Tiffany almost doesn't notice it. A car parked across the street a little too often. A supplier who suddenly can't fulfill an order that had been confirmed the week before. A regular customer who cancels an appointment and never rebooks, apologizing vaguely about a change in circumstances he won't explain. She mentions it to Michael almost in passing, the way you'd mention a headache that hasn't gotten bad enough to worry about yet. Probably nothing, she says. Business goes through slow patches. How many slow patches happen all at once, 3 weeks after a billionaire sits down at your booth? She doesn't have an answer for that. Neither does he, not yet, though the question sits with him longer than he lets on. It's around this time that she finds the journal, and not entirely by accident. She's cleaning out a storage closet at the back of the workshop, moving boxes that haven't been touched since her father died, when a loose floorboard beneath one of the shelves catches her foot. She almost ignores it. Something makes her kneel down and pry it up instead. Underneath is a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and soft with age, filled with her father's handwriting, except large sections of it aren't in any language she recognizes. Numbers mixed with symbols. Diagrams that look like shoe patterns but don't quite match anything he ever produced publicly. Dates scattered through the margins, all of them from the months before the accusation. She sits on the floor of that closet for almost an hour, turning pages, trying to understand what she's looking at. One phrase, written in plain Korean at the bottom of a page dated 2 weeks before everything fell apart, stops her cold. If something happens to me, the truth is in the final piece. She doesn't know what the final piece is. She doesn't remember her father finishing anything unusual in those last weeks, nothing beyond the small. Quiet work that filled his final months. But she knows, sitting there with the notebook open in her lap, that this isn't nothing. Her father didn't write in code for no reason. He didn't hide things under floorboards out of habit. She calls Michael before she fully decides to. "I need you to see something," she says, "and I need you to not ask me how I found it until I've had a chance to explain it myself." He's there within the hour. Somewhere between the second and third hour of poring over her father's notebook, she looks up and finds him watching her instead of the pages, and neither of them looks away right away. Nothing happens. Nothing needs to. But something settles into place between them that night that has nothing to do with the mystery on the table, and everything to do with the way he reaches over, without thinking, and tucks a loose strand of hair behind her ear before either of them says a word about it. "Sorry," he says quietly, not sounding sorry at all. "Don't be," she says, and goes back to the notebook, though her hands aren't quite as steady as they were a minute ago. They spend that night at her kitchen table, the notebook open between them, trying to make sense of pages that resist being made sense of. Michael recognizes some of the shorthand, not the code itself, but the format, a style of notation used sometimes in manufacturing contracts to protect proprietary details from competitors. "Your father wasn't hiding a secret," he says slowly. "He was protecting evidence." "Evidence of what?" "I don't know yet." He flips back several pages, frowning at a diagram that resembles the sole pattern of a formal dress shoe, annotated with numbers that don't correspond to any measurement system either of them recognizes immediately. "But I know people who might." Over the following days, Michael starts asking careful questions inside his own company, not directly about Samuel Parker, but about the accusation itself, the design that was supposedly stolen, the executives who handled the dispute 7 years earlier. He's careful. He's discreet. He still isn't careful enough. 2 separate executives go quiet the moment he brings up the old case. A third changes the subject so abruptly it might as well have been an alarm going off. When he mentions it to a longtime family associate over dinner, the man's hand pauses halfway to his glass before he forces a laugh and says he doesn't remember the details, though something in his face suggests he remembers them perfectly well. "Someone doesn't want this looked at," Michael tells Tiffany afterward. "Someone's been making sure of that for 7 years," she says. He pushes harder than he probably should, 3 days later, cornering the family associate a second time in the man's own office instead of over dinner, where politeness has less room to hide behind. "I'm not asking as a curiosity," Michael says, closing the office door behind him. "I'm asking as someone who's going to keep asking until somebody answers me honestly." The man's composure slips for the first time, just slightly, just enough. "Some things are better left where they were buried, Michael, for your sake as much as anyone's." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you." The man's eyes flick toward the door, toward the hallway beyond it, as if he's worried about being overheard even now. "Ask your father. If he tells you nothing, that will tell you something on its own." Michael doesn't get anything more out of him that day, but he leaves the office with a new certainty settling over the old one. Whatever happened to Samuel Parker 7 years ago didn't happen in some obscure corner of the industry. It happened close. Close enough that people inside his own family's orbit know exactly what it cost, and exactly who it protected. They both understand, without needing to say it aloud, that whoever buried the truth once is still protecting it now, and that asking questions has already put both of them somewhere neither of them fully chose to be. Jai-woo notices the shift in her brother before he says anything about it. She finds him standing on the terrace of the family estate one evening, staring at nothing in particular, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating in his hand. "You've got the face," she says, joining him at the railing. "What face?" The one you get when you're trying to protect someone and you haven't figured out from what yet. She bumps his shoulder with hers. Whatever it is, you're not doing it alone. I like her too, remember. He doesn't tell her everything that night, but he tells her enough: the journal, the coded pages, the strange quiet that falls over grown men whenever Samuel Parker's name comes up. Jaiwoo listens without interrupting, and when he finishes, her expression has lost all its earlier lightness. Be careful, she says. If this reaches as high as it sounds like it does, the people protecting it won't stop at a few canceled orders. She's more right than she knows. The final piece, Tiffany eventually realizes, isn't a metaphor. It's a shoe. Her father's last completed work sits on a high shelf in the workshop, wrapped in cloth that hasn't been disturbed in years. A ceremonial piece, ornate and unfinished by his usual standards, the kind of commission he never talked about and never delivered. She'd always assumed it was simply the last thing he made before he got sick, a project abandoned when his hands could no longer manage the fine work. She takes it down one evening, Michael beside her, and turns it over slowly under the workshop lamp. The construction is different from anything else her father ever made: a slightly thicker heel, an extra layer stitched into the arch that serves no functional purpose she can identify. She runs her fingers along the inner sole and feels it before she sees it. A seam that shouldn't be there, stitched with a slightly different tension than the rest of the shoe, as if it had been closed by hand after the piece was otherwise finished. There's something inside this, she says quietly. Michael goes, still beside her. Are you sure? I've been making shoes since I could hold a needle. I know what my father's stitching looks like when he's not hiding something. Her hands hover over the leather for a moment before she moves. 7 years of questions sit inside this single object, and some part of her isn't ready to know the answer even as the rest of her can't stand not knowing another minute longer. This is why, she says, mostly to herself. He never got to clear his name. He wanted someone to find it. He wanted me to find it. She retrieves a small blade from her workbench, her hands steadier than she expects them to. Given how hard her heart is working, Michael doesn't say anything. He just stands close, watching the door out of habit more than actual suspicion, though something about the stillness of the workshop tonight feels different from every other night she's worked late. Whatever this is, she says quietly, more to steady herself than to inform him, it's the reason he never got to clear his name. I know it. I've known it since I found the notebook and didn't want to admit it. Then let's find out together. You don't have to stay for this. I know I don't. He says it simply, without any performance in it at all, and it lands harder than a more dramatic promise would have. I'm staying anyway. She holds his gaze for a moment longer than she needs to, something passing between them that has nothing to do with mystery or money or the 7 years that brought her to this exact evening. Then she looks back down at the shoe in her hands, and the workshop falls quiet except for the soft, careful sound of a blade working through old, stubborn thread. She begins to cut along the hidden seam, carefully, the way her father taught her to unpick stitching without damaging the leather beneath it. The thread gives way in small increments, one stitch at a time, and beneath it she can just make out the edge of something that isn't leather at all, paper, folded tight, tucked into a cavity built specifically to hold it and nothing else. That's when the front door of the workshop rattles. Not knocked. Rattled the specific, deliberate sound of someone testing whether it's locked. Tiffany freezes, the blade still in her hand. Michael's head turns sharply toward the front of the shop, where the shape of 2 figures is visible through the frosted glass, unmoving, clearly waiting for something. Tiffany, his voice drops low. Is that door locked? She doesn't answer right away because she's trying to remember. She locked it when Michael arrived. She's almost certain she locked it, and in the half-second she takes to be sure, the handle turns. It doesn't open. Not yet. But whoever is on the other side isn't leaving either. The workshop lamp flickers once. And somewhere in the back room, something heavy scrapes. Against the floor, a sound that has no business happening on its own, not unless someone is already inside. Michael steps in front of her without thinking twice about it, and Tiffany's hand tightens around the half-finished shoe in her palm, the seam still open, the folded paper still hidden inside it, seconds away from being seen for the first time in 7 years. The door handle turns again. This time, it doesn't stop. Glass cracks near the back entrance, and a second later the sound of footsteps, more than one set, moves fast through the storage room toward the front of the shop, toward the workbench, toward the one piece of evidence that 7 years of silence was built to protect. Tiffany's first instinct isn't fear. It's the paper in her hand, still only half visible inside the leather, still unread, still hers to protect for one more second before anyone else decides otherwise. She closes her fingers around the shoe and steps back against the workbench, and Michael reaches for the workshop's heaviest cutting shears without taking his eyes off the door. Not because he thinks a pair of shears will stop what's coming, but because standing there with empty hands has never once been an option for him. The front door gives way first, wood splintering at the frame, and the shape of a man fills the doorway with the streetlight behind him, his face obscured, his purpose unmistakable. "Where is it?" the man says. Not a question. A demand 7 years in the making. If you want to know who's on the other side of that door and what's finally about to come out of that shoe, make sure you're subscribed, because part 2 picks up the exact moment this one ends, and it does not slow down from there.